To be able to introduce our belated arrival, good friend Asef Bayat, who will be giving the keynote address. I'm not going to give you the full expanded version of his bio, but he is the Catherine and Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. And he previously had taught at Leiden University, and he had edited the sadly now defunct wonderful Issim publication. Asef is enormously prolific, and just to give you an example, this year, 2013 alone, he has 2 books coming out. One, Life as Politics, How Ordinary People Change the Middle East, and well, that's the second edition, and Post-Islamism, the changing faces of political Islam. So let's give Asef a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Lisa. First of all, let me express my really appreciation for, Yes, let me express my appreciation for being included in this wonderful exchange. Professor Dalal, Sari, Lisa, I'm sure there are others who have organized this great gathering. Also, sorry for those who actually came here for Rashid Khalidi. I'm sorry. So what can I do? I'm speaking today about the relationship between everyday life and revolutions, more kind of specifically between the kind of mundane on the one hand and the monumental on the other hand. Today, it is basically has become a commonplace sort of claim and belief that Arab revolutions have surprised everyone. In fact, a lot of people were surprised, from intelligence services, governments, even the protagonists themselves. But then, every revolution is a surprise, no matter how the protagonists themselves are convinced of its coming. The French Revolution has been, said that it came as a surprise. It's been reported very much. Lenin himself, although he was an organizer and so on, he became very much surprised a couple of months or 6 months or 7 months before. He said that he would not live to see this great sort of revolution. Iranian, Ayatollah Khomeini had said earlier that it would take 2 centuries for this regime to be toppled. In fact, after towards the end, he really didn't believe that things would change. We were revolutionaries at the time, although we always said that history is on our side, but really we didn't believe it. But when it happened, it surprised us. So why surprise? The economist Timur Kuran has argued that revolutions are surprised because people who have discontents, they don't reveal their discontents, they don't talk about it. And then the observers, governments and so on, they don't know about the existence of discontent. And then when something happens, something triggers a protest, these people join in, and this evolves into big revolutionary movements. And then we all get surprised. I think this is a very interesting thesis to sort of ponder about, certainly. But at least empirically speaking, in my experience of living in both Egypt and Iran before the revolutions, I really could observe that actually people did speak out in the public arenas. In fact, I would say, and I got this notion of public nagging from our societies, that it is a significant moment in creating public opinion. People just complain about a lot of things, even if, and usually put finger on the government, even if the government is not responsible for the kind of misfortune that may have. And I think this kind of nagging is also part of this sort of broader sort of notion of what I've called political street, like Arab street, by which I mean the collective sentiments, shared feelings, and public opinions of ordinary people in the sort of day-to-day utterances and practices, which are usually expressed in public spaces, in taxis, in buses, in lining, in rationing lines, or street demonstrations, and so on and so forth. So a lot, I would say, was really being said. But more importantly, and that will be my emphasis and my focus today, more importantly, a lot was being done in practice, in everyday life, in the sort of underside of the society by the poor people, by young people, by women in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. But they really got little attention in the media and even by the scholars like ourselves. I think us scholars focus more on issues which were pertinent to sort of regime stability and continuity and so on, or we focus a lot, and I included myself, on Islamic movements, although Islamic movements were supposed to be sort of destabilizing, but by and large it was believed that it is sort of contained. There was some discussion of a particular kind of understanding of civil society. So I think the prevailing view was that there isn't really force to bring about change. People do not do really much to bring about change. And I have to say here that the celebrated Human Development Report, arguably the most, I think, significant sort of manifesto of change on the Middle East, Arab Middle East, couldn't see, I think, any other alternative for change, but, I quote, a realistic solution of a Western supported project of gradual and moderate reform aiming at liberalization, unquote. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of vision somewhat that existed. Yet, revolutions did happen, and I think we all got surprised. But I think surprise lay, in my view, not in people not speaking, but suddenly acting, but it lay in that intriguing sort of moment when the mundane meets the monumental, when the everyday sort of entails the breakthrough, when ordinary becomes extraordinary. We still really don't know about the mechanism of this breakthrough, and I'm totally obsessed with this issue, really, how breakthrough happens, how it happens, why in the 15th of June 2009 in Rome, where 2 million people were in the streets of Tehran, it didn't happen. Why in Leipzig in 1989, it just happened. And in 25th of January, was it? It happened. Why? So I'm obsessed with this issue, and I'm trying to sort of work on it and so on. But one thing I don't know yet, but one thing I can really say here is that there is a kind of puzzling dynamism in certain practices of everyday life that in the right time and in the right sort of place kind of converge and sort of engages in the monumental political events like revolutions. And here, I'd like to make a sort of few tentative propositions and explore the place of social movements and civil society notions in this context. So everyday life and revolutions seem to be the opposite end of this spectrum, because everyday life signifies the mundane, the ordinary, the insignificant, the routine, the non-spectacular. It signifies continuity, stability, compliance, and the status quo. Whereas the revolution is big, is huge, is spectacular, is kind of rupture, is transformation, is struggle. I think despite this polarity, I think that there is a really strong, obviously, link between the two. And here, really, I'm not talking about very otherwise interesting notions like everyday revolutions, right? There are books about it, or silent revolutions, which either it's kind of metaphorical or, I think, point conceptually to some sort of step-by-step or piecemeal changes, in society, right? I'm not talking about that. I really mean, everyday life on the one hand and revolutions on the other hand. I'd like to propose that perhaps everyday and spectacular might be kind of mediated through the mechanisms or dynamism of what I've called non-movements, right? Maybe non-movements are able to explain sort of the connection. So I've talked about non-movements in my book, Life as Politics, which came out just before the revolution in 2010. But here I just say a couple of words and then to make a point. By non-movements, I'm referring to some examples like the mundane but prolonged struggles of the urban poor to acquire certain amenities for life, like shelters, like water, electricity, phone lines, schools, and then they want jobs. But perhaps, in short, they want a dignified life. Or the daily struggle of women in the families, in the educational institutions, in workplaces, courthouses, or in public spaces to achieve equal power in making decisions, personal status and personal rights, or social standing, and in asserting themselves as especially public players. Or I'm thinking of, the activities of very much dispersed, disconnected, unorganized, young people to pursue their sort of what I call youthfulness, to pursue their individuality or challenge the social control of political authority or moral authority in the form of expressing certain lifestyles or in certain subcultures, things like orphan marriage and so on and so forth. Or you can speak of the activities of international illegal migrants or undocumented migrants and so on, which is becoming very interesting in the West as well. These are just some of the small examples, but you probably know more. So in this sense, non-movements really are the collective action of non-collective actors. They are not organized, they are dispersed, which really take place in everyday life and produces significant, in my view, changes in the actors' lives and also in the society in which they operate. They are neither survival strategies, or rather, actually, they are not just survival. They go beyond survival strategies because they are encroaching. They are not social movements. They are not, as such, civil society institutions in the way that we understand them. Rather, they're the kind of activism and struggles that are part and parcel of the practices of everyday life. So they often remain invisible, and they remain quiet, and therefore unnoticeable. Because in this sense, there is not a politics of protest. They are not going around making protests in order to gain shelters, but actually they go around and actually gain their shelters, right? Jobs, like street vendors, for instance. But in this sense also, they kind of make incrementally encroaching claims against power holders, against the property, and also sometimes, but not always, against the public at large. Now, carried out by a large number of ordinary people, even if disorganized, they tend to produce alternative, even if extra-legal sort of norms in society, which are often, I think, articulated in the language of rights. If the actors even push further, they can get these claims that in practice they make to be recognized by law. And in this sense, I think their struggle, by and large, is a struggle for citizenship. Right? Either citizenship is de facto, but it can be actually de jure if actually is recognized by a law. Now, the crucial thing is that while the repressive regimes may be able to crack down on organized movements, social movements, or civil society association, they're really unable to suppress such fluid and amorphous sort of non-movements, because stopping them would be equal in some way to stopping life. It would be, of course, they are doing. I mean, they are demolishing and so forth, but they get also resistance on the part of these people. Now, in the stable times, I think non-movements serve as an important venue to enhance sort of actors' life chances. But in certain junctures, however, these dispersed, unorganized struggles may assume organized and collective forms. First of all, if, for instance, this happens, for instance, when the gains of these actors are threatened. So if people go around and actually acquire homes and make shelters and create communities, if those communities are threatened, then actually they get together and fight against it. So they become very much collective. But beyond that, when actors perceive an opportunity, right, a political opportunity in which they are able to organize themselves, actually they do so, if they see benefit in doing so. In this way, this sort of their dispersed and kind of individualized struggles may coalesce and merge into larger sort of protest movements when such protest movements become available. Now, I want to say that such scenarios seem to exist just before the revolutions, in Egypt or in Tunisia. For instance, the idea of sort of self-immolation that happened, by Sidi Bouzid and so on, actually had existed earlier as well. And people like Abdul Salam Terimish in 2009 had, in the same situation, had actually committed suicide by putting himself on fire. Or there have been a number of sort of collective protests of sort of jobless, and this is extremely important in Tunisian context. The protest of jobless graduates in 2006, 2008, and 2009 in places like Kabes, in Sfax, or Basra. In Egypt, we know, and all of you know, that in the sort of later years of the the last decade, there have been important struggles around the issues of collective consumption, especially on water and shortages of electricity in Cairo, in Giza, in Fayoum, Kafr Sheikh, or Port Said. Or you have collective protests against home demolitions in Manshad Nasser, in Duwaika, Azbahijana, and so on. Or the protests of tuk-tuk riders and minibuses. And of course, garbage collectors, everybody has heard, what happened in 2009. And not to mention, of course, the protests against price rises and bread and so on and so forth. Interestingly, some of these protests that were carried out largely by dispersed, as I said, individualized actors who then sort of coalesced and produced this collective protest had also been mobilized by young activists, especially in 2010. So when in 25th of January, activists went to the poor neighborhood of Imbaba, the speed of mobilization of the poor people was quite astonishing. The report says in about half an hour or so, thousands actually, the poor people joined these demonstrations now. I think this is extremely important because the presence of ordinary poor people like I mentioned give usually an enormous, I think, boost and strength to these extraordinary activities carried out by, for instance, young people. I think youth probably initiated these extraordinary uprisings, but youth on their own can never generate a revolutionary breakthrough. I think the breakthrough comes only when the ordinary people like this get engaged in these extraordinary activities. That is making huge demonstrations against a regime, going simply beyond the everyday life sort of activities. Now, during the revolution, this was kind of before the revolution. During the revolution, I think the uprisings, a segment of the poor, if we focus on the poor people, especially the abject poor or migrant poor, tend to sort of hesitate from direct involvement because a lot of them don't know the consequence of it. It's just too big. They usually wait and see what the consequence will be, and then they make a decision. Whereas other segments like what I call the middle class poor or educated poor or especially laboring poor, those people who work in factories and so on, they do get engaged in these activities. Now, during the uprisings, but at the same time, while they are engaged in these sort of protest activities, they are also take advantage of the breakdown in sort of police control and accelerate their quiet encroachment. So they take over lands or occupation of apartments, that the government has built for maybe others, but they take over, spreading businesses in the main streets, and we've seen what's happening in central Cairo or in Tunis, around Medina. There are thousands of them that spread their businesses there. And as for the young people, the youth, I think at this time their loose networks in public spaces or schools or street corner gatherings usually did coalesce into clearly political organizations. Those who were already in sort of civil activism, and some of you have worked on this issue, sort of youth voluntary, for instance, NGOs, they get engaged very much politically. But what happens just after the revolutions? The immediate post-revolution is a time when these non-movement or such non-movements may turn into organized social movements and protests. The absence of usual suppression and the vision of sort of new social order gives an enormous opportunity for subaltern groups to bring their quiet encroachment into surface, to forge alliances, be mobilized by activists and political parties, and create organization and push for their claims. I think in the case of, for instance, women in sort of post-revolution, because of the sort of nature of the regime, it is very likely that they would be sort of engaged in having sort of organization in order to at least defend their rights. I think this is probably happening in Egypt, especially in Tunisia, in the same way that it happened after the revolution in 1979 in Iran. As for the young, I think there has happened an explosion of youth organizations and civic activism, both in Cairo, in Tunisia, as well as in Egypt. And here, Karima has worked on it, and there are others who have worked on it, and it's extremely significant. As for the poor people, I think at this time, the segment of the poor continue to take advantage of the, again, security breakdown to pursue their mostly sort of individualized sort of direct actions more sort of aggressively. So in Egypt, just within the 6 months after the revolution, over 100,000 hectares of land, according to the government, have been really taken over illegally to construct shelters. Of course, there are a lot of opportunists who get involved as well too, and there's no doubt about it, but also a lot of poor people also take advantage. Thousands of street vendors took over strategic spots in central districts in big cities in Cairo and Tunis to their to spread their merchandise. In Tunis, places like Saïd Mourabia or Tadamun, where the sort of the poor live in Tunis, they try to extend their sort of shelters within their communities and better actually to better their lives. So these are the kind of individual activities that are carried out, being in a position when they can use the opportunity to do so. But in the meantime, collective protests, the collective protests and organization also surges. And in fact, it has surged. In Cairo, for the first time, the Association of the Ashwaiyat was set up to protest and improve these conditions. In rural areas, the farmers, forged syndicates. Scores of neighborhood councils emerged to attend their well-being. Activists and architects and so on, and artists were involved in enhancing the poor people's campaign. So there was this sort of coalition in the sense of the poor people, ordinary people, as well as the activists. In fact, for instance, the street vendors, it is said that there are 5 million of them in Egypt, began for the first time to initiate, to form a union, not just in Cairo, but in other cities as well. But no other sector, perhaps, no sector matched the sort of industrial labor in terms of protests. In Egypt, just last year, there were about 2,000 industrial actions. In Tunisia last year actually entered into Guinness Book as the most protesting nation in the world, 60 per day, 60 per day. Now, I'm not here discussing the mushrooming of professional association and political parties. Of course, in Tunisia, 100 actually political parties emerged just after the revolution. In Egypt, about 15 or so, I'm told. So the immediate post-revolution is a time of flourishing collective action and social movements, because beyond the renewed sense of optimism and energy, there develops a political opportunity, right? Indeed, I think the possibility of organization and self-expression is the most important achievement of these revolutions, right? If nothing is achieved, this is the most important. And I think this opportunity should be utilized so well. So social movements have emerged, and they are surging in these countries. And I think there is so much to kind of cherish about social movements. They drastically, of course, the risk of mobilization. Look, in non-movements, although the people achieve a lot, but it's very risky, right? It's very risky. It involves a lot of insecurity on the part of the actors, whereas social movements are sort of less. They can generate a culture of collectivity and solidarity, and their very operation, in fact, can be achieved in itself, their very operation, because they produce also culture, right? They serve as a school for to sort of practice cooperation, debate, critique, and civil society engagement. And of course, if they are powerful enough, they can actually push for tangible results, right? They protest to gain something, right? If they are powerful enough. But let's remember that these are also the time of the emergence of counter movements, right? The emergence of the movements that you and I do not like, might not like, right? So, you know, people have spoken about Salafis and so on and so forth. These are the time where different kinds of things emerge, right? Not necessarily the kind of things that we like, right? But it could be counter movement and can work against, right, the very objectives that, you know, certain groups like women, young people, or the poor actually are striving for. Also, let's not remember that the social movement depend on very much on skill and energy and especially opportunity. I think they can operate freely only if the states tolerate them, right? If the states do not tolerate them, they just, then people would resort to other types of activism. They would continue only, oh, that's another thing. They would continue only if they see a tangible outcome. Otherwise, people may resort to different kinds of venues. That's how I explain why non-movements emerge even in democracies, right? Even if people can organize themselves, why they resort to sort of a more individualized sort of direct action. And one reason is that even if they go around and protest a lot, nothing happens at the end of the day. And that's very significant. Yeah. So, the current spate of social movements, I think, is largely the outcome of the revolutionary opportunity. But these are exceptional times. I think it's so important to remember these are exceptional times. These are the revolutionary movements, moments when an extraordinary energy has been really released in society. It's very important to think of the normal time, to think of in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, how things will, what will happen. I think many of these organizations and movements that have emerged, it's very likely that they will disappear. Already a number of organizations, especially youth organizations, have already disappeared. So a new form of organization will emerge, but others will disappear. and now given, however, consequently, given the nature of these regimes, and that's also very important, you know, the operation and the nature of movements or the type of activism, very much also, not entirely, but very much related to the nature of the state as well, right? The nature of the state. I think so far, the nature of the state, the regime, sorry, currently in the post-revolutions are largely patriarchal. They are economically neoliberal and politically illiberal, or socially illiberal. So I think for this reason, it is likely that non-movements actually might become an important venue for social struggle. Even though I think the working people, especially those people who are working in the industries, is very likely that the organization will continue, they will fight for it, because they can't resort to non-movements, right? They need, factory workers and those people who work in the workplaces, they need to focus on collective action. Because of the fact that also organized activism is not really easy. As I said, it needs skill, it needs energy, it needs leadership, sometimes it needs funding. And at the same time, organized activism also requires, certain sort of responsive state. As I mentioned, it's very important that your activism, result in some kind of a outcome. If it doesn't, then again, people resort to different kinds of activities that bring about more sort of immediate gains. Um, so for this reason, I think that non-movements and quiet encouragement are likely to get back again on the agenda. Indeed, the everyday is likely to, this is not a big statement to make, it's very obvious, is very likely to assert its logic on the spectacular, on the sort of revolutionary exceptionalism. I think, as I said, non-movements are likely to remain an important form of subaltern struggle for citizenship. But the question is how and what concept of sort of civil engagement can handle this type of activism. And this brings me to my last point. The question is, what is the, in a sense, the space of civil society activism in this context? I think civil society activism, civil society has certainly a place in this. Of course, depending on what one means by it. Do we mean by civil society as a part of society, which largely have meant kind of associations? So associations are a civil society. Or do we mean by civil society as the entire society to be civil, meaning good society, good governance, good market, and so on? Or do we mean civil society in terms of public sphere, right? Meaning public debate or dialogue for the achievement of common good. This is kind of the types that, of understanding that are available. And some people like Michael Edwards, who writes about these things, have actually put them together to produce a normative notion of civil society. That is the combination of all this. But I think it's important, for me, it's important to see what in real life, not that how civil society should be, but how it is actually is and how it has been perceived to be. I think in reality, the prevailing concept is the first one, really. It's the kind of associational life, right? And basically that means, political parties, unions, clubs, and NGOs. But in recent years, actually, this even has been reduced to largely NGOs. So civil society actually has come to mean NGOs. While, for instance, the government might allow NGOs, but they might not allow labor unions, right? So for this reason, I think there has been a lot of criticism against it, that civil society and NGO being equal to it has basically an equal, unequal power. Some are stronger than the other, some get more favors than the other. Or it really badly depends on and is accountable to the donors rather than the beneficiaries. It is largely legalist and so functions merely on it, and I mean functioning merely on it can avert us from paying attention to more interesting and more perhaps prevailing forms of activism which are not necessarily legal. They could be extra legal, right? And in short, really they can turn into what Ferguson called anti-politics machine. And it is in this spirit that in places like India or Venezuela, left-wingers, activists, by and large, they dismiss civil society as basically neoliberal, right? They don't deal with it anymore. But I think my understanding is that we shouldn't really generalize civil society. It's very complicated because I think that the value of civil society is relative to the context within which it operates, right? Precisely for this reason, for the fact that it is so unequal, I wouldn't really dismiss it, even if it is only meant NGOs. I wouldn't dismiss it. I wouldn't throw it out altogether. I think certain NGOs, especially advocate ones, have shown that they can be incredibly effective in our part of the world. A lot of human rights organizations, not all of them, have been very, very significant. Or in Egypt, the Initiative for Personal Rights, they are doing wonderful jobs, I think. Or the Association for Labor Services, or many, I think, women's NGOs or journalist NGOs in Iran, for instance. They are so effective and they are so important, right? It is important, I think, to support them. In fact, I would say, and that's my last point, such NGOs developed by skillful and educated activists and people like lawyers can link up with both social movements and amorphous non-movements to generate a subaltern bloc. I think this is how I see a good way to go about, to raise and address the passing and pressing social and economic claims. In other words, for instance, why not lawyers get involved in helping street vendors to form their union, right? Because a lot of them don't know how legality works, how the system works, and so on and so forth. Or one can give a lot of examples in this respect. So therefore, a progressive civil society, even if reduced to social to NGOs, plus social movements and non-movements can form a very, I think, formidable bloc for the betterment of the lives of a lot of people. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to ask a few questions at a time?
Thank you very much. I wondered if it's. I think the case of Syria is a bit interesting, and I didn't hear anything about it in your presentation. I wondered if you are, conducting any studies on Syria. It is interesting because I think we know how the thing has started in Syria, police abuse which have degenerated in Daraa. But then many cities and towns have, because of that, went into peaceful demonstrations. And the case, so far as everyday life and everyday resistance is concerned, would be to see. I mean, I've tried to study this from the perspective of everyday resistance, as with Sari, and at some point there is a question. People have tried to sustain and conduct their lives and resist, by mundane things. But at a certain point, there is a sense, a consciousness that there is a limit to resistance, and because of that, people have become conscious in various towns in the north, not particularly related to Daraa, which is in the south, that resistance is limited, and that the hardship on the local level cannot be reduced to technical problems or local problems. They are connected to the national decision making at the national level, and it is an immensely political question which is related to the way in which decision making is taking place in Damascus. So I think that people have carried out resistance, and in the midst of a crushing security apparatus, and there is a limit to resistance. Resistance is premised on the idea that one needs not to seek to undo the system, and that people have become conscious that we now want to undo the system. And my question would be, to what extent the resistance that had taken place was able to offer a certain repertoire or a certain narrative, which in fact have, brought, action to, a certain culmination, which is real revolution. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for being provocative as always. I accept fully your empirical description of what was going on in Egypt before the uprising, but I think it's important to add some other things which don't exactly fit your theory, so maybe you would like to expand or change the theory. And so first, there were very active, very visible social movements in the decade before January 2011. There was Kifaya, there was a movement to support the independence of the judiciary, and the regime was quite aware of it and exercised a fair degree of repression, not as much as it would have in the 1990s when the insurgency of the Islamists overdetermined the extent of repression of everything. There was also the labor movement. I won't have to talk about that at great length, but it was huge, and by and large, not repressed. By and large, when workers made demands, they won. most, if not all, of their economic demands. The big exception was April 6, 2008, because the workers at Bahal al-Kubra wanted to go on strike in favor of a national minimum wage. That's a red line. You can strike for your local thing. You can't strike for anything having to do with national policy. So that was there, and it was known. Even journalists knew about it. One of them actually told me my editor won't let me write about those things, but journalists, I mean, Kafaya, yes, workers know. So that was known, and I think you have to take that seriously into account as among the vectors that came together at a certain moment. Also, the same forces, April 6th Youth Movement and similar forces, who called for the demonstration on January 25th, had done so several times before. So August 8th, 2009, to commemorate the strike that didn't take place in Mahala the previous year, a couple hundred people came. Police Day in 2009 and 2010, for the same reasons as January 25th, 2011, a couple hundred people came. So what was the difference? The difference is what Doug McAdam called tactical innovation in social movements. Part of it you mentioned. One, instead of calling on people to go to Tahrir Square, where you come and get surrounded by 2,000 security forces and no one can even see you or know what you're doing, they began the demonstrations in the neighborhood. So by the time they reached medium-sized squares, the number of demonstrators was already bigger than the number of security forces, and they were able to break through. And that happened on the 25th, but even in a much bigger way on the 28th, which is really the day when a revolutionary program was, not so much a program, but a revolutionary feeling was expressed by torching the headquarters of the National Democratic Party. The other thing was some 20,000 leaflets were given out in those neighborhoods in the days before. So very low tech. Probably, if they had done that a year before, they might have gotten the same result. But somehow or other, they hit on these important tactical changes, which had nothing to do with the internet. And this made that demonstration much bigger than anybody expected it to be. So I think it's important to be precise and maybe massage the theory a little bit to take account of those things.
Thank you. I just want to think with you through that notion of non-movement movements or quiet encroachments that you think about, that you've been putting forward for years and how it's moving right now. And one of the things that I think is really interesting to think about is that when you had those non-social movements, or when you had quiet encroachments and informal settlements, for example, in Cairo, you had people taking over quietly little pieces, which I think had a very strong dimension of the political, because there's a motivation of the notion of justice, and of it's not just I want to live, there's a notion of respectability and justice that is always forwarded in those activities. Now, what we saw recently is that this kind of justice is going way beyond. So we saw, for example, a video of a community in Cairo that got together to build actually a bridge to the highway from their informal settlement and actually connecting to the city's main transportation network. So to me, this is a spatialization of a different kind of claim, where I am no longer only thinking of my neighborhood, but I'm thinking that I'm part of the city, and somehow the city's infrastructure needs to encompass me. And so I'm wondering if you see in that, or when you see in that, the making actually of a collective claim, of a new form of a public that is spatializing in these kinds of claims. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I just directly to your point. It's true. These things actually have begun to take place, especially in Cairo, actually less probably in Tunisia. And it is a time that, as I said, those individualized activities which prior to revolutions brought about, I think, significant gains for the individual actors themselves. Now they are, I think, assuming more collective dimension. And I think one of the criticism has been leveled against this notion of against the notion of quiet encroachment and non-movement is that it actually works, well, it seems to work within the broader new liberal sort of ideas of individual self-interest, right? My response to that has been that this individual act have been largely tactic, not a value, because when the opportunity arises, like in post-revolution, in fact, those individual acts coalesce into creating a more sort of collective form, and assume even so the spatialized form that you are talking about. I mean, I have not really worked out in terms of the spatial manifestation of this, which is so fascinating. Yeah, but in terms of largely sort of activism and what kind of transformation, in a sense, takes place in the consciousness of the actors in the course of struggle. Then, of course, the question is what would be the relationship between this kind of formations and the activists, so the professional activists, right? And I think this is very, I think, important and pertinent in the discussion with the role of NGOs and civil society and so on. About Syria, yes, you're right. I mean, I do not really know about Syria, and I've been there for a couple of times, and unfortunately, really, I haven't done any really research work on Syria. I read about it, and I do understand, of course, just during early stages of the uprising there, certain patterns that emerged both in Tunisia and in Egypt emerged there as well. But pointing to your the centrality of your sort of question, what sort of kind of result this sort of resistance lead to? Let me say that the kind of non-movement I'm talking about are not meant to necessarily generate a revolution in the way that we understand. But in the process, it can coalesce into a revolutionary movement. So we should not expect really necessarily too much from non-movements in terms of generating a revolution. They never mean actually to generate a particular revolution. However, when it happens, the dynamics of non-movements actually changes because revolution actually provides an opportunity for them. So going back, I think that also links up with Joel's question. Yes, I mean, what actually you described in terms of the emergence of those social movements in Egypt in those decades, I totally agree. I think that, in fact, since 2003, I think a dramatic change, began to really take place. Maybe 2001, maybe, in fact, the first time when Tahrir Square actually was occupied, right? I think I happened actually to be there with the students and so on. And so that was the day. After that, things began to change. I think in that decade, a lot of people basically lost the fear of protesting in public. And the more you protest in public, it became became part of the culture of protestation, being in public and saying things and so on and so forth, right? So that struggle itself provided an opportunity, a cycle of opportunity for others to actually come in. That it is possible to protest, and then here becomes, the then protests of those people sometimes that we do not expect them to do, the very poor people, right? As if that they are basically clinging to their own daily lives in their neighborhoods and so on. They actually began to protest too, right? So it opens a possibility, an opportunity for others to join in. Yeah.
Okay. Last question goes to Rami, and keep it short, please.
Thank you, Asef. The range of activities you described are very important, very clear. We've been watching them for decades here in the region. The reality, I think, is that almost none of these movements, even when you get civil society and NGOs and social movements and individual activism and resistance and neighborhood and non-movements, all of them together, none of them have really touched the question of power and sovereignty until you get a revolution. And even now, as you wrote recently, these revolutionary reformist movements are still unclear what they're going to do. Do you see any mechanism by which these movements you described can actually influence the ultimate goal, which is changing the nature of power and sovereignty so that it leads to social justice, equity, opportunity, etc.?
I think that I don't want to kind of read too much into kind of movements or non-movements that I'm talking about. But as the more I think about them, although their activities began incredibly mundane, that a lot of people describe in terms merely of survival strategies, right? I think, however, it is important to realize that it really goes beyond that. It is really incrementally encroaching and moving forward. In some way, even if they're allowed to move forward, they can actually circumvent the power. Well, power could be local power, and then perhaps sort of national power. And the other thing which is relevant to what you were sort of asking was the transformation in the language of this kind of activities, so that the language of rights becomes very significant, right? And in this sense, it is very much related to, as I said, the struggle for citizenship. Right? But beyond that, I mean, these movements do not have a particular program about, explicitly what kind of a state we have explicitly, but implicitly, however, they require the kind of a state that is really responsive. But as the more I think about them, although their activities began incredibly mundane, that a lot of people describe in terms merely of survival strategies, right? I think, however, it is important to realize that it really goes beyond that. And it is really incrementally encroaching and moving forward. In some way, even if they're allowed to move forward, they can actually circumvent the power. Well, the power could be local power, and then perhaps sort of a national power. And the other thing which is relevant to what you were sort of asking was the transformation in the language of this kind of activities, so that the language of rights becomes very significant, right? And in this sense, it is very much related to, as I said, the struggle for citizenship, right? But beyond that, I mean, these movements do not have any particular program about, explicitly what kind of a state we have explicitly, but implicitly, however, they require the kind of a state that is really responsive to their particular needs, and the kind of needs that is progressive and moving, right, and enlarging, right. So responsive, in a sense, and democratic state, even if they do not necessarily articulate very clearly in the language. Thank you.
I told everyone who was frustrated, you'll get another crack at Asef at the last roundtable. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.